I call the Honourable Tim Grosser.
Well, Mr Speaker, the gloves are starting to be taken off as we face up to the choice at the end of November. And I have to say that the choice is rather clearer a lot sooner than I would have expected. Well, from the government side, the Prime Minister's laid it out today for New Zealanders as to what we represent. And essentially the centrepiece from an economic perspective is, to use his own words, we must move this economy away from debt-fuelled consumption. Other ways of putting it, but that's as good as any way you could find. And what does that mean in practical terms? Well, I think it means a number of different things. First of all, it means continuing with what I would describe as actually a very moderate program of fiscal consolidation. We know what happened with 9 years of Labour. Core Crown expenditure went from $32 to $60 billion as the truckloads of money were deposited outside government agencies' doors. We know that the average annual increase in core government spending was $2.8 billion, and we're trying to hold it to a tad under $1 billion. It's not an extreme position, but fiscal consolidation is absolutely a central part of moving from debt-fuelled consumption. Secondly, we're trying to streamline the public services, and while we will hear an enormous amount of rhetoric from other political parties on this, it's actually entirely possible to do this while delivering better services to New Zealanders with fewer resources. Not radically fewer resources, but we're essentially seeking efficiency gains. The public sector has not been asked seriously in the last 9 years of the Labour government to face up to the need to produce more with either the same or slightly fewer resources. So that is the second objective or way in which we're going to try and move this economy from debt-fuelled consumption. Third, we're absolutely 100% serious about not letting this very delicate international economic situation spook us. We're proceeding with further investment in the infrastructure of this country. We must invest in our own future, Mr Speaker, in order to generate the growth that New Zealanders will need to pay for all the social services, the education and the other things that we all want and value. And part of that process, yes, it will involve, in terms of capital expenditure, looking a little more creatively at mixed ownership models. Again, we're going to hear selling off the family's jewels, the silver and blah, blah, blah for the next 10 months. But actually, they're not listening to the conditions that the Prime Minister and Mr English have so very clearly laid out. We will retain 51% government ownership in those assets, and we will deliver good services. And when they talk about electricity prices, who could forget that the average annual increase in electricity prices over the 9 years of the previous government was 9% per annum. 9% per annum. And they're talking about the threat of electricity price rises. The next element, carefully laid out in the Prime Minister's statement of our program for this year, a program that he said must be the year, 2011 must be the year for New Zealand, is we're going to promote vigorously export growth. We have some advantages now of a very good pattern of trade opportunities. We have excellent commodity prices. And let's back ourselves, Mr Speaker. Let's back ourselves to shift more and more resources into the export side. And as the Prime Minister pointed out, when you look at the last 5 years of the Labour government, not one new net job was added to either the efficient import competing or export sector. It was all in the consumption side of the economy, fuelled by debt. The next element in our choice to New Zealanders is we're going to continue, again in a very moderate and sensible way, to simplify, it's the word I'd use, simplify the regulatory frameworks. And you've heard the Prime Minister, Mr Speaker, today outline the key elements around more sophisticated work on the RMA and more flexible labour markets that will actually end up creating jobs for companies that need the flexibility to take the risk of employing people as they move forward in what is an uncertain environment that New Zealand, along with all countries in the world, faces. And finally, I'd also instance, we're about incentivising middle New Zealand. We are about creating a basis where middle New Zealanders can see a way forward for themselves and their families. And since September 2008, the average after-tax income of all New Zealanders on the average wage has increased by $64 per week. $64 per week. That's a 16% increase, or just look at the stats, 16% increase in the average annual after-tax salary. Take away 6% price increases. What it means is that if you're in Kiwi on the average wage, you are earning after tax 10% more today than you were in September 2008. So that's on the government side. And I talked earlier, Mr. Speaker, about a rather clear choice, I think, emerging for the public to make in late November. So what does it look like on the Labour side? Well, I was reading an article, an op-ed article in the Herald by Mr. Brian Rudman, and I was reading it carefully. I can't say that I always agree with Mr. Rudman, but I thought he made a very interesting point. His thesis was sort of like this. The summer holidays are over, it's back to work for everyone, including the politicians, and what's the first thing the new white hope of the Labour Party, Grant Robinson, thinks would be a great idea to kick off the year with? Well, let's have a new holiday paid for by somebody else. Let's have a new holiday paid for by somebody else. We have the same debate now going on with respect to the minimum wage, where we have made a very modest adjustment that preserves the after-inflation current minimum wage. Labour wants to add, $2 or something to it? So we have to ask ourselves, try and reduce this to the actual reality of New Zealand. You know, we don't have, by normal international standards, many genuine small and medium enterprises. We have micro enterprises, Mr. Speaker. According to one study I recall, in 2005, 86% of New Zealand enterprises were 5 people or less. So you're asking companies like this to pay for another day's holiday and a massive increase in the minimum wage if they happen to be employing minimum wage workers, which would immediately generate demands for relativity from the other workers they employ. How could anyone believe that our companies are in a position under these circumstances facing New Zealand along with all developed countries in this very uncertain international environment? How could anyone believe that they could just sign a cheque and have no consequences for the viability of either their company or for continuing the employment of those people? So, I'm just absolutely astonished by this. And when you put along those two examples, which are in the current debate, alongside Labour's emerging programme, stripped of all rhetoric, what does it really add up to? Well, I think it's very clear, Mr. Speaker, what it adds up to. It's a policy of let's spend more government money and let's tax more. Now, you have to ask yourself, what is going on here? What is going on here? If I sit down and look at, for example, the interim report of the Working Savings Group, I've got a couple of quotations that sort of nail the underlying position I think that we as a country are facing. And we can have different views on what adjectives to use about New Zealand. We can have different views about the specific policies that the interim report of the Working Savings Group, chaired by Kerry MacDonald, puts forward, and that's legitimate. But I don't understand how anyone could seriously have a different view about the underlying driver of what they're talking about. And let me just give you, Mr. Speaker, a couple of quotations. Quote, "The bottom line is that New Zealanders have collectively been spending too much and saving too little. Our credit is maxed out. It's time to get real." Quote, "We've had the fun, we've had the big spend up, now it's time to pay back debt and lay the foundations for sustainable future wealth." So what is going on here with Labour? And I mean, is this really a policy, a tax and spend policy, which, as the Prime Minister pointed out in his concluding comments, suggests they've learnt absolutely nothing from the last 9 years of their own government? What is going on here? Is this seriously an alternative government policy structure that they're asking New Zealanders to endorse at the end of November this year? Well, one could provide different explanations, but I'm rather inclined to think that the real motive here is to avoid an electoral catastrophe. It's about their core vote, shoring up their core vote to position themselves for a possible win in 2014, not 2011.